The temperature outside Thomas Brennan's cabin was minus 18 degrees Fahrenheit on the morning of January 12, 1878. Inside, without a fire burning for 11 hours, the cabin registered 61 degrees. Before we dive in, let us know where you're watching from, and if stories like this move you, hit that subscribe button, because tomorrow's episode is even more unbelievable than this one. Thomas Brennan stood in the doorway of his cabin wearing only a wool shirt and canvas trousers. The air outside cut like broken glass. His breath formed thick clouds that hung suspended in the stillness before dissolving into the frozen morning. 3 miles down the valley, smoke rose from a dozen chimneys in the Boulder Creek settlement, each column a testament to fires that had been stoked repeatedly through the night. Thomas had not touched his fire since yesterday afternoon. He watched Jakob Muller struggle up the narrow canyon path, boots crunching through snow that reached his knees. Jakob carried an armload of firewood, each piece coated in a layer of frost. His face was drawn with exhaustion. Thomas knew that expression well. It was the look of a man who had risen 4 times during the night to feed a fire that refused to keep his family warm. Jakob stopped 20 yards from the cabin, breathing hard from the climb. He stared at Thomas standing there in his shirt sleeves, then at the cabin behind him. No smoke rose from Thomas's chimney. The windows glowed with soft yellow light, but there was no sound of crackling wood, no smell of fresh burning pine. Thomas stepped aside and gestured toward the interior. Jakob entered slowly, suspicious of what he could not explain. The cabin was warm. Not the fleeting warmth of a freshly stoked fire, but a deep, steady heat that seemed to radiate from the walls themselves. Jakob set his frozen firewood on the floor and pulled off his gloves. He touched the stone wall beside the door. It was warm to the touch. Thomas had built this cabin 2 years earlier in a location that made no sense to anyone in the Boulder Creek settlement. Instead of building in the valley near water and open land, he had hauled materials uphill into a narrow canyon and constructed his cabin backward into the rock wall itself. The other settlers had called it foolish. They said grief had broken his judgment. They predicted he would abandon the strange structure before the first winter ended. But Thomas had not abandoned it. He had lived through 2 winters in the canyon cabin, and each winter had proven something the others could not yet understand. The massive stone walls that surrounded his cabin on 3 sides were not just shelter. They were a furnace that burned without fuel, a battery that stored the sun's warmth and the heat from his fire and released it slowly through the long frozen nights. Jakob stood near the cold fireplace, turning slowly to examine the space. The back wall was not logs but bare stone, part of the canyon itself. The side walls were the same. Only the front wall, the one with the door and windows, was constructed from timber. The design looked unfinished, as if Thomas had started building a proper cabin and then simply stopped. Thomas watched Jakob try to make sense of it. He had seen that confusion before. People expected cabins to follow rules, to look a certain way, to be built according to methods passed down through generations. What Thomas had built followed different rules written by physics rather than tradition. The winter of 1875 had been ordinary by Montana Territory standards. Cold arrived in November and settled in for 5 months. Snow accumulated in drifts that reshaped the landscape. Temperatures dropped below zero and stayed there for weeks at a time. Thomas Brennan had experienced 6 previous winters in the territory. He knew what to expect. His cabin that year sat in a meadow 2 miles from what would become the Boulder Creek settlement. It was a standard structure built using methods every frontier settler knew. Logs notched at the corners, chinked with mud and moss, a single door facing south, 1 small window, and a bark roof covered with sod. Thomas had built it in 5 days with help from 2 neighbors. It was adequate shelter, nothing more and nothing less. Margaret was pregnant with their 2nd child. Their daughter Sarah was 3 years old. The cabin was crowded but warm enough when the fire burned steadily. Thomas kept a substantial woodpile stacked against the north wall. He had cut and split enough timber to last through winter with surplus to spare. The cold snap arrived in late January. Temperatures that had hovered around zero dropped suddenly to -15, then -20. The wind picked up, driving through every gap in the cabin's chinking. Thomas fed the fire constantly. He burned wood faster than he had calculated, but he still had reserves. On the fourth night of extreme cold, Sarah developed a cough. By morning, she was fevered. Margaret wrapped her in every blanket they owned and kept her near the fire. Thomas went out in the brutal cold to cut more wood. The existing supply was disappearing faster than seemed possible. He returned to find Margaret also fevered. The cold had found its way into their lungs despite the fire that Thomas kept burning without pause. He sat up through that night, feeding logs into the fireplace every hour. The interior temperature never rose above 45 degrees. The walls radiated cold inward faster than the fire could push warmth outward. Sarah died on the 6th day of the cold snap. Margaret followed 2 days later. Thomas had burned through his entire winter wood supply trying to keep them warm. The cabin had failed in its most fundamental purpose. It had not protected his family from the cold. He buried them when the ground thawed in April. He spent the summer in a state of numb functionality, trapping and hunting mechanically, speaking to almost no one. Other settlers attributed his silence to grief, and they were partially correct. But grief was only half of what consumed Thomas. The other half was a question that would not leave him alone. Why had the cabin failed? He had built it correctly according to every standard he knew. He had maintained the fire continuously. He had done everything right by conventional measure. Yet his family had frozen despite his efforts. The failure meant either that winter was simply too powerful to resist, or that the conventional methods were fundamentally flawed. Thomas began to suspect the latter. Thomas spent the spring and summer of 1876 asking questions no one else considered worth asking. Why did caves stay warmer than open air during cold nights? Why did stone walls near campfires remain warm hours after the flames died? Why did certain locations in the mountains feel warmer than others, even when temperatures were identical? Other settlers noticed his strange behavior. He would sit motionless near rock formations for hours, observing nothing apparent. He built small fires against stone walls and monitored them as they burned down, touching the rock repeatedly, timing how long the warmth persisted. He explored every cave and overhang within 10 miles of Boulder Creek, carrying a thermometer he had ordered from a supply catalog. Jakob Mueller found him one afternoon sitting inside a shallow cave, recording temperatures in a leather journal. Jakob asked what he was doing. Thomas explained he was measuring how stone held heat compared to air. Jakob nodded politely and left, convinced that grief had damaged Thomas's mind. The story spread through the settlement. People began calling him the Cave Hermit. Thomas did not care what they called him. He was discovering principles that frontier construction ignored entirely. Wood was an insulator, which meant it blocked heat from escaping, but also blocked heat from entering. A log cabin trapped whatever warmth a fire produced, but only while the fire burned. Once the fire died, the cabin cooled rapidly because wood held no heat of its own. Stone was different. Stone absorbed heat slowly and released it slowly. A stone wall warmed by fire would radiate that heat for hours, sometimes for an entire night. The thicker the stone, the more heat it could store. A cave surrounded by hundreds of tons of rock became a thermal battery, absorbing warmth during the day and releasing it through cold nights. Thomas began carrying rocks of different sizes back to his temporary camp. He would heat them in his fire, then wrap them in blankets, and monitor how long they stayed warm. A rock the size of his fist stayed warm for 3 hours. A rock the size of a water bucket stayed warm for 8 hours. He extrapolated what a rock wall 10 feet thick might do. The implications were obvious to Thomas but invisible to everyone else. If he built a cabin surrounded by stone rather than isolated in open air, the stone would act as a passive heating system. The fire would warm the stone, and the stone would warm the cabin long after the fire went cold. The solution required no new technology, no expensive materials, just a different understanding of how heat moved through materials. By midsummer, Thomas had filled his journal with observations and calculations. He knew the specific heat capacity of different stone types. He knew how quickly various rocks absorbed and released warmth. He understood thermal mass in a way that most trained engineers of the era did not. His education came not from books, but from methodical observation and relentless questioning. In August, he began searching for the right location. He needed a place where stone naturally surrounded a buildable space, where he could construct a cabin inside rock rather than beside it. He explored every canyon and cliff formation in the Boulder Creek drainage, looking for nature's perfect heat battery. Thomas found the location on a warm afternoon in late August 1876. Boulder Canyon cut through granite cliffs 3 miles upstream from the settlement. Most trappers and settlers avoided the canyon. It was steep, narrow, and led nowhere useful. The creek at its bottom was difficult to access and offered no obvious advantages over easier water sources in the valley. Thomas had walked past the canyon mouth a dozen times before deciding to explore it thoroughly. He followed the creek upstream, climbing over fallen rocks and wading through shallow pools. The canyon walls rose higher as he progressed, blocking direct sunlight and creating a shadowed corridor of stone and water. A mile into the canyon, he found what he had been searching for without knowing exactly what it would look like. The creek bent sharply around a granite outcrop, and on the inside of the bend, the rock face curved inward, creating a natural alcove. The overhang extended outward 20 feet from the back wall and rose 30 feet above the canyon floor. The space underneath was protected from rain, snow, and wind. Thomas stood in the alcove and turned slowly, examining the geometry. The back wall was solid granite, vertical and relatively smooth. The side walls angled inward, creating a space roughly 18 feet wide at the opening and 12 feet deep. The ceiling was uneven but solid, formed by the underside of the massive rock shelf that jutted out from the cliff face. He built a small fire in the center of the alcove and watched how the heat behaved. The stone walls reflected warmth back toward the center. The smoke rose and spread across the ceiling before finding its way out the open front. Within an hour, the entire space felt noticeably warmer than the outside air, despite the fire being small. Thomas let the fire burn down to coals. He sat against the back wall and waited. The stone behind him radiated warmth. He checked his thermometer. The air temperature in the alcove was 12 degrees warmer than the creek bed 30 feet away. The fire had been out for an hour. He spent that night in the alcove with a blanket and a rebuilt fire. When he woke in the pre-dawn darkness, the fire had died completely. The air was cool but not cold. He placed his hand on the stone wall. It was still warm to the touch, holding heat from a fire that had been dead for hours. This was the location. The canyon provided everything he needed. The alcove was deep enough to build a cabin inside while leaving the stone walls exposed. The overhang would serve as a natural roof, eliminating the need for complex roof construction. The granite walls represented thousands of tons of thermal mass that would absorb heat from the sun, from his fire, and release it slowly through cold nights. The practical disadvantages were obvious. The location was 3 miles from the settlement, uphill from the valley, far from convenient water sources. He would have to haul every supply up the canyon path. The site was dark, receiving direct sunlight only during midday hours. Building inside the alcove would be more difficult than building in open terrain. But Thomas was not interested in convenience. He was interested in survival. The canyon alcove offered something no valley meadow could provide: the ability to stay warm without burning through enormous quantities of firewood. The stone would do most of the heating work passively, requiring only enough fire to charge the thermal battery each day. Thomas spent September 1876 planning a cabin that violated every conventional building principle settlers knew. He sketched designs in his journal, calculating dimensions and material requirements. The structure would be unlike anything built in the Montana Territory, and Thomas understood that unconventionality would invite mockery. A standard frontier cabin used 4 walls of stacked logs, forming a rectangular box. The walls were the structure's defining feature, separating interior from exterior. Thomas's design eliminated 3 of those walls. The canyon stone would serve as the back wall and both side walls. He would build only the front wall from logs, creating a barrier that sealed the alcove opening. The floor plan measured 16 feet wide and 12 feet deep, maximizing the alcove space while leaving clearance on both sides. The front log wall would stand 8 feet tall, meeting the rock ceiling at a slight angle. He would need approximately 30 logs for that single wall, far fewer than the 100-plus logs required for a traditional four-wall cabin. But the critical element was not what he would build, it was what he would not build. Thomas would leave the stone walls completely exposed inside the cabin. Most builders would have covered the rock with wood planking to create a uniform interior and additional insulation. Thomas wanted the opposite. He needed maximum stone surface area exposed to interior air so heat could transfer efficiently between fire and rock. The foundation design broke from tradition as well. Standard cabins sat directly on ground, sometimes on a few flat rocks to keep the lowest logs from rotting. Thomas planned a stone foundation that would connect the cabin floor thermally to the canyon floor and walls. He would build up a rock base around the alcove perimeter, creating a continuous thermal bridge between all stone surfaces. The roof would be minimal since the rock overhang provided natural protection. Thomas would build just enough roof structure to seal the gap between his front wall and the canyon ceiling. The design would save materials and labor while maintaining the thermal envelope he needed. Window placement was critical. Thomas planned 2 windows in the front wall, positioned to capture winter sun when it angled low through the canyon. The windows would be larger than typical frontier cabin windows, allowing maximum sunlight to penetrate and warm the back stone wall. He would install no windows on the sides where they would only create heat loss. In early October, Thomas visited the Boulder Creek settlement to purchase supplies. He needed window glass, door hinges, nails, and various hardware items. At the trading post, he mentioned to the owner that he was building a cabin in Boulder Canyon. The news spread quickly. By evening, Jakob Mueller and 2 other settlers came to ask if the rumor was true. Thomas confirmed he was building in the canyon alcove. Jakob asked why anyone would build so far from water and civilization. Thomas explained his reasoning about thermal mass and heat retention. The settlers listened politely, then exchanged glances that Thomas recognized. They thought he was mad. Jakob suggested gently that perhaps Thomas should reconsider, build something sensible in the valley near others. Thomas thanked him for the concern but said the canyon location was not negotiable. Within a week, the entire settlement knew about Thomas Brennan's foolish plan. People called it the Cave Hermit's Folly. Some predicted he would freeze. Others wagered he would abandon the project before winter. No one believed it would work. Thomas began construction in mid-October 1876, with weather still mild enough for masonry work. He loaded a borrowed mule with tools and materials and made the 3-mile journey to the canyon alcove. The trail was steep and narrow in places, requiring careful navigation. Each trip took 2 hours uphill, 1 hour returning empty. The first task was clearing the alcove floor of loose rock and debris. Thomas worked methodically, removing everything down to solid stone. He found the canyon floor relatively level, sloping only slightly toward the creek. The natural drainage would prevent water accumulation inside the finished cabin. With the floor cleared, Thomas began building the stone foundation. He gathered rocks from the creek bed and canyon slopes, selecting pieces that were relatively flat and stackable. The foundation would rise 2 feet above the alcove floor, creating a level platform for the cabin structure while establishing thermal connection with the surrounding stone walls. He mixed mortar using clay from the creek bank, sand, and water. The mixture was not strong by modern standards, but Thomas was not building a load-bearing wall. The foundation's purpose was thermal bridging, creating continuous contact between the cabin floor and the canyon's thermal mass. He laid rocks carefully, filling gaps with mortar, building the foundation ring that would support his front wall. The work was slow. Thomas could haul only so much material per trip. He worked alone, spending 3 or 4 days each week at the canyon site, returning to the settlement for supplies and to maintain his trapline. Other settlers occasionally passed the canyon mouth and saw smoke from his work fire. The gossip continued. Thomas ignored it. By early November, the foundation was complete. The stone ring stood 2 feet high, 16 feet wide, and extended 12 feet back into the alcove. The surface was reasonably level. Thomas had created a platform that connected thermally to thousands of tons of granite surrounding it. Next came the logs for the front wall. Thomas needed straight, uniform timber approximately 10 inches in diameter. He spent a week selecting and cutting trees from forested slopes 2 miles from the canyon. He stripped each log completely, removing all bark and shaping the surface with a draw knife. The process was exhausting, but Thomas wanted tight fits between logs to minimize gaps. Hauling logs to the canyon was brutally difficult. The mule could drag 1 log at a time uphill. Thomas made 15 trips over 2 weeks, accumulating the timber he needed. By late November, 30 stripped logs lay stacked near the alcove. Winter was approaching fast. Temperatures dropped below freezing at night. Snow fell intermittently. Thomas knew he could not complete the cabin before serious winter arrived, but he could finish the walls and door, creating basic shelter. The roof work could wait until spring. He began stacking logs for the front wall, notching them where they met the stone side walls. Each log was fitted carefully, gaps minimized through patient shaping. Thomas used clay mortar between logs and where wood met stone, creating seals that would prevent air infiltration while allowing thermal contact. The wall rose slowly. 1 log per day was good progress, given the fitting required. Thomas worked through light snow, through days when his hands went numb, through mornings when frost covered everything. By mid-December, the front wall stood complete, 8 feet tall, sealed against the elements. The completed front wall created an enclosed space that transformed the alcove from natural feature into habitable structure. Thomas stood outside in falling snow, examining what he had built. To any conventional builder, the cabin looked fundamentally wrong. 3 walls were bare stone, rough and unfinished. Only the front wall showed proper construction. Jakob Müller visited on a cold December afternoon, curious despite his skepticism. He climbed into the alcove and walked the perimeter, touching the exposed stone walls. He asked why Thomas had not built interior log walls over the rock to create proper insulation and appearance. Thomas explained that exposed stone was the entire point, that covering it would defeat the thermal purpose. Jakob shook his head. He pointed out that stone was cold, that everyone knew rock walls made buildings colder, not warmer. Thomas countered that stone was cold only when cold, warm when warm, and that the mass itself was what mattered. Jakob left unconvinced, certain that Thomas would discover his mistake when deep winter arrived. But Thomas was not guessing. He understood principles that frontier experience had not taught most settlers. Wood insulated, which meant it blocked heat transfer in both directions. Stone conducted, which meant it moved heat from warmer areas to cooler areas until equilibrium was reached. In a cabin heated by fire, that meant stone absorbed heat from the air and held it, creating a reservoir of warmth that would radiate back when the fire died. The key was surface area. Thomas had calculated that the exposed stone walls inside his cabin represented approximately 400 square feet of thermal mass. If that stone warmed even 20 degrees above ambient temperature, it would store enormous amounts of heat energy. Releasing that energy slowly overnight would maintain interior temperature without continuous fire. Thomas began sealing the gaps where his log wall met the stone sides. He used clay mortar mixed with sand and horsehair for reinforcement. The mortar filled cracks and created weathertight joints, but Thomas left the stone surface itself completely exposed. Every square inch of rock needed contact with interior air. The ceiling required attention as well. The natural rock overhang was not perfectly flat. Gaps existed where the overhang met the top of Thomas's front wall. Cold air could infiltrate through these openings. Thomas mixed more clay mortar and carefully sealed each gap, climbing on a crude ladder to reach the ceiling joints. The work was tedious, but essential. He built a door from thick planks, fitting them tightly and reinforcing the assembly with cross braces. The door hung on iron hinges he had purchased in the settlement. It sealed well enough to prevent drafts, but was not elaborate. Thomas planned improvements for spring, but for now he needed basic function. With the walls, ceiling gaps, and door complete, Thomas had created a sealed envelope. The space was dark, lit only by whatever daylight came through the door when open. He would install windows later. For now, he needed to test the fundamental concept before investing more effort. He built a fire in the center of the dirt floor, using stones to contain it. The fire was small, burning perhaps a third of the wood a standard cabin fireplace would consume. Smoke rose and found its way out through small gaps Thomas had left near the ceiling for ventilation. Within 2 hours, the interior temperature had risen noticeably. Thomas touched the stone walls. They were warm. The back wall especially, facing the fire directly, had absorbed significant heat. He let the fire burn down and waited through the night, monitoring temperature. The stone radiated warmth for 9 hours after the fire died completely. Spring 1877 arrived with warming temperatures and snowmelt that turned the canyon creek into a roaring torrent. Thomas had survived his first winter in the partially completed cabin, validating the thermal mass concept enough to justify finishing the structure properly. The roof remained his primary spring project. Most frontier cabins required substantial roof construction. Ridge poles spanning the width, rafters at close intervals, planking or poles across the rafters, bark or shingle covering, and often a layer of sod for insulation and waterproofing. A proper roof represented half the labor of building a cabin. Thomas's situation was different. The granite overhang already provided the actual roof. It extended 20 feet from the cliff face, covering the entire alcove with solid stone 3 feet thick. No rain or snow could penetrate it. No wind could lift it. The overhang was better than any roof Thomas could build. His task was simply sealing the gap between his front wall and the underside of the overhang. That gap varied from 6 inches to 18 inches, depending on the irregularity of the rock ceiling. Thomas needed to close the opening while maintaining his thermal envelope and providing smoke ventilation. He designed a solution that was minimal but effective. He cut thin poles from nearby pines, each about 4 inches in diameter. These poles would span horizontally from the top of his log wall to the rock ceiling, filling the gap. Thomas stripped the poles and shaped their ends, notching one end to sit on the top log and cutting the other end to fit snugly against the uneven stone surface. Installing the poles required careful measurement. Each one needed custom fitting because the ceiling height varied across the 16-foot width. Thomas worked from one end to the other, measuring, cutting, and fitting each pole individually. He secured them using wooden pegs and clay mortar, creating a rigid connection to both the log wall and the stone ceiling. The poles were spaced approximately 8 inches apart, close enough to support covering material but leaving gaps for smoke ventilation. Thomas had observed during winter that smoke rose and spread across the ceiling before finding small gaps to exit. He wanted to preserve that natural ventilation while preventing weather from entering. Over the poles, Thomas laid split planks he had prepared from straight-grained pine. The planks overlapped like shingles, each covering the gaps in the layer below. He did not nail them rigidly, but rather pegged them loosely, allowing slight movement. The planks created a barrier against rain and snow while maintaining flexibility for thermal expansion. The final layer was birch bark, laid in overlapping sheets and sealed with pine pitch. The bark provided waterproofing and filled remaining gaps. Thomas left intentional small openings near the back where smoke could exit freely. The ventilation system was passive and reliable. The completed roof weighed perhaps 1/10 what a traditional cabin roof weighed. It required minimal materials and integrated seamlessly with the rock overhang. Standing outside, the cabin appeared to have no roof at all, just the natural stone shelf extending protectively overhead. Thomas purchased 2 window frames with glass panes from a traveling merchant who passed through Boulder Creek in May 1877. The glass was expensive, costing nearly a quarter of what Thomas had earned from his previous winter's furs. Other settlers questioned why he would spend so much on windows when oiled paper or scraped hide worked adequately. But Thomas understood that windows were critical components of his heating system, not mere conveniences for light. The sun's energy was free and abundant. Capturing it efficiently could reduce firewood consumption substantially. Window placement and size would determine how much solar heat reached the stone walls to be stored for nighttime release. He positioned the first window in the front wall, approximately 3 feet above the floor level and slightly left of center. The opening measured 2 feet wide and 18 inches tall, larger than typical frontier cabin windows. Thomas cut through the logs carefully, creating a rectangular opening with level sills and square corners. The second window went in at the same height, positioned right of center with 4 feet of solid log wall between the two windows. The spacing allowed maximum light entry while maintaining structural integrity of the front wall. Together, the windows would admit sunlight across most of the cabin's width during midday hours. Thomas installed the frames using techniques he had learned from a carpenter in St. Louis years earlier. The frames were set into the log openings and secured with wooden pegs driven through pre-drilled holes. He sealed gaps around the frames with his clay mortar mixture, creating weather-tight installations. The glass panes were already mounted in the frames. Thomas handled them carefully, aware that broken glass was irreplaceable in the Montana wilderness. The panes were wavy and imperfect, typical of frontier available glass, but they were transparent enough to serve their purpose. With both windows installed, the cabin interior transformed. Sunlight streamed through the openings, creating bright rectangles on the back stone wall. Thomas observed how the sun's angle changed throughout the day. In morning, light hit the eastern portion of the back wall. At midday, both windows illuminated the full width. In afternoon, the western section received concentrated sun. He monitored the stone temperature where sunlight struck directly. Within 2 hours of sun exposure, the rock surface was noticeably warmer than surrounding areas. By late afternoon, the sun-warmed sections radiated heat into the cabin air. The windows were functioning exactly as Thomas had calculated. The thermal benefit was quantifiable. On sunny spring days, Thomas could maintain comfortable interior temperatures with minimal fire or sometimes no fire at all. The sun warmed the stone during daylight hours. The stone released that warmth through the evening. Only during extended cloudy periods or extremely cold nights did Thomas need substantial fires. Jakob Mueller visited again in June and noticed the windows. He commented that they seemed oversized and poorly positioned, letting in too much cold air at night. Thomas explained they were positioned for winter sun angle, not summer. Jakob remained skeptical but was running out of criticisms as the cabin took its final form. Late June 1877 brought the first opportunity for comprehensive thermal testing. The cabin was complete. All gaps were sealed, windows installed, door fitted properly, and the ventilation system functioning as designed. Thomas needed to understand precisely how his heating system performed before the next winter arrived. He began by establishing baseline measurements. Using his mercury thermometer, Thomas recorded exterior temperature, interior temperature, and stone wall surface temperature at multiple locations. He took readings at dawn, midday, dusk, and midnight for 3 days without any fire, documenting how the cabin behaved passively. The results showed that interior temperature remained approximately 8 degrees warmer than exterior temperature without any heating. The thermal mass of the surrounding stone absorbed ambient heat during the day and released it at night, creating slight stabilization. It was a modest effect, but measurable and consistent. Next, Thomas tested fire heating efficiency. He built a small fire in a stone-lined pit he had constructed in the cabin's center. The fire burned seasoned pine, carefully measured for weight. Thomas recorded how much wood he burned, how long the fire lasted, and how interior and stone temperatures responded. The fire burned for 4 hours, consuming approximately 12 pounds of wood. Interior air temperature rose from 58 degrees to 74 degrees within the first 2 hours. The stone walls warmed more slowly, but eventually reached 68 degrees on their interior surfaces. Thomas let the fire die completely and continued monitoring. Over the next 12 hours, interior temperature declined gradually. 6 hours after the fire died, the cabin still registered 66 degrees, while exterior temperature was 52 degrees. 12 hours post-fire, interior temperature had dropped to 60 degrees, still 8 degrees above outside air. The stone walls were releasing stored heat exactly as Thomas had predicted. He repeated the test multiple times, varying fire size, burn duration, and starting temperatures. The pattern remained consistent. The stone absorbed approximately 60% of the fire's heat energy. It released that stored energy over the following 10 to 14 hours, depending on exterior temperature and wind conditions. Thomas calculated firewood requirements based on these tests. A standard frontier cabin required continuous fire to maintain comfortable temperatures, consuming 30 to 40 pounds of wood daily during cold weather. His canyon cabin could maintain similar comfort with one 12-pound fire per day, potentially less during sunny periods when solar gain supplemented heating. The efficiency gain was roughly 3 to 1. Thomas could stay warm all winter using 1/3 the firewood a conventional cabin required. For a lone trapper, that difference meant spending far less time cutting and hauling wood, reducing one of winter's most exhausting and dangerous tasks. He documented everything in his journal: temperature curves, burn rates, thermal decay patterns, and solar contribution. Calculations filled pages with data that would have been meaningless to most frontier settlers, but represented the scientific validation Thomas needed. Thomas relocated permanently to the canyon cabin in early September 1877. He packed his belongings onto the mule and made his final trips from the temporary camp he had maintained near the settlement. Everything he owned fit into 3 loads: traps and hunting equipment, food supplies and cooking implements, bedding and personal items. The move attracted attention. Jakob Mueller and several other settlers gathered to watch Thomas load the mule for his last trip. Jakob asked one final time if Thomas was certain about this decision. The canyon location was remote, isolated, far from help if something went wrong. Thomas thanked him for the concern but confirmed he was committed to the move. The settlers made predictions about how long Thomas would last. Some gave him until Christmas before he returned to conventional shelter. Others wagered he would make it through one winter but abandon the canyon by spring. A few thought he might survive but expected the isolation would break him mentally. No one predicted success. Thomas settled into the canyon cabin methodically. He built a proper bed frame from pine poles, raising his sleeping platform 2 feet off the floor. The elevation provided storage space underneath and kept him away from the coldest air that settled at floor level. He constructed shelves along the front wall for supplies, positioning them where they would not block window light. The fire pit became more refined. Thomas lined it with flat stones arranged in a circle, creating a contained area for fires. He positioned the pit slightly off-center, closer to the back wall, maximizing heat transfer to the largest stone surface. A simple iron grate salvaged from an abandoned camp served as a cooking surface. He established daily routines suited to canyon life. Morning began with assessing weather and checking the thermometer. If the previous night's stored heat had maintained comfortable temperature, no morning fire was necessary. If the cabin had cooled significantly, Thomas built a small fire that would burn for 2 or 3 hours while he prepared breakfast and organized his day. Water came from the creek below, requiring a steep climb down and back up with filled buckets. Thomas made one water trip daily, hauling enough for drinking, cooking, and minimal washing. The inconvenience was significant, but manageable. He had known the water situation before building and accepted it as the price of superior thermal performance. Firewood storage became an important consideration. Thomas needed to stockpile enough wood to last through winter, but he needed far less than conventional cabin dwellers. He spent late September and early October cutting and splitting timber from dead standing trees within a mile of the canyon. He stacked the wood inside the alcove near the cabin entrance, protected from snow by the rock overhang. By mid-October, Thomas had accumulated what he estimated was 3 cords of seasoned wood. A settler in the valley would need 8 to 10 cords for winter. Thomas's canyon cabin required only a fraction of that amount. The efficiency advantage was already evident before winter truly began. Jacob visited once in late October, climbing the canyon trail to check on Thomas. He found the cabin organized and comfortable, Thomas in good health and spirits. Jacob admitted the setup looked more livable than he had expected, but maintained that winter would be the real test. Winter 1877-78 began in mid-November with the first substantial snowfall. 6 inches fell overnight, covering the canyon in white silence. Thomas woke to a cabin that registered 54 degrees internally with no fire since the previous afternoon. Exterior temperature was 28 degrees. The 26-degree difference came entirely from residual heat stored in the stone walls. He built a morning fire, small and efficient, burning perhaps 8 pounds of wood over 3 hours. The interior warmed to 68 degrees. The stone walls absorbed heat steadily. By early afternoon, with the fire long extinguished, the cabin maintained 64 degrees while outside temperature had risen only to 32 degrees. Thomas established a winter routine of 1 fire per day, built in late morning and allowed to burn for 3 to 4 hours. The timing captured maximum benefit from any available sunlight while providing warmth that would carry through the night. On cloudy days, he sometimes built a second smaller fire in the evening, but sunny days required only the single heating. December brought colder temperatures but nothing extreme. Most nights dropped into the teens. A few particularly cold mornings saw 0 degrees. Thomas's cabin handled these conditions easily. The thermal mass strategy worked as predicted. Heat stored during the day sustained comfortable sleeping temperatures through the coldest nights. He kept detailed records in his journal. Daily high and low exterior temperatures, interior temperatures at morning and evening, wood consumption, and notes about weather conditions filled pages with data. The pattern was consistent. His canyon cabin maintained interior temperatures 25 to 35 degrees warmer than exterior with minimal fuel consumption. In late December, Jacob made the difficult climb through snow to check on Thomas. He had expected to find Thomas struggling with the cold, perhaps low on firewood, possibly reconsidering his canyon experiment. Instead, he found Thomas comfortable and well supplied, the cabin warm without a fire currently burning, and the woodpile barely diminished. Jacob asked how much wood Thomas was burning daily. Thomas estimated 10 to 12 pounds average. Jacob calculated he was burning 30 to 40 pounds daily in his valley cabin just to keep his family barely comfortable. The difference was substantial and undeniable. Something about Thomas's design was working far better than conventional construction. But Jacob remained skeptical about long-term viability. The winter so far had been relatively mild. Temperatures cold but not brutally so, snowfall moderate, no extended severe weather. Jacob predicted that a truly harsh winter would reveal the canyon cabin's limitations. Thomas did not argue. He simply continued his routine and recorded his data. January brought slightly colder temperatures. Several nights dropped below 0. Thomas increased his fire size modestly but maintained his once-daily heating schedule. The cabin performed well. On the coldest morning, with exterior temperature at -8 degrees, the interior registered 51 degrees before he built his fire. The 49-degree difference represented pure thermal mass storage, no active heating for 16 hours. By late February, Thomas had burned approximately 1 cord of his 3-cord supply. Winter was nearly over, and he had abundant fuel remaining. The efficiency advantage was proven beyond question, at least for a moderate winter season. Winter 1878-79 arrived with unusual ferocity. November brought temperatures that normally appeared in January. By early December, the Boulder Creek settlement was experiencing conditions that old-timers claimed were unprecedented. Nighttime lows dropped below 0 regularly. Daytime highs struggled to reach 15 degrees. Snow accumulated in drifts that buried fences and blocked trails. The settlers in the valley faced immediate challenges. Firewood consumption doubled from normal winter rates. Families burned through their stockpiles faster than anticipated. Men spent entire days cutting and hauling wood just to keep up with nightly demand. The work was exhausting and dangerous in extreme cold. Jakob Müller's cabin became a battleground against freezing. His wife Anna tended the fire constantly during waking hours. At night, they took shifts, one person rising every 3 hours to add wood and stoke flames back to life. Their 3 children slept in coats and blankets piled high. The cabin interior rarely exceeded 50 degrees, despite continuous fire. Other families reported similar struggles. The Hendersons ran critically low on firewood by Christmas and had to borrow from neighbors. The Carlson family suffered frostbite when their fire went out overnight during a particularly brutal cold snap. An elderly trapper named William Morrison was found dead in his cabin in early January, frozen after running out of fuel. The winter was killing people through simple thermodynamics. Standard log cabins could not retain heat efficiently enough to survive extended extreme cold without consuming unsustainable quantities of firewood. The settlers had built adequate shelter for normal Montana winters. This winter was not normal. Word reached Thomas through occasional visitors who braved the canyon trail to check on the hermit they expected to find in dire circumstances. Instead, they found Thomas comfortable, well-supplied, and burning firewood at rates that seemed impossibly low given the conditions. His woodpile remained more than half full in mid-January, while valley settlers were running out completely. Thomas increased his fire frequency slightly, building 2 fires daily during the coldest periods instead of his usual single fire. But even doubled, his consumption remained a fraction of what valley cabins required. The stone walls were performing exactly as he had calculated, storing heat during firing periods and releasing it slowly through the long frozen nights. The canyon location provided additional advantages Thomas had not fully anticipated. The narrow canyon blocked wind almost completely. Valley cabins faced constant wind that stripped heat through every crack and gap. Thomas's alcove was sheltered, the rock walls breaking any air movement before it reached the cabin. The still air retained warmth more effectively than the constantly disturbed air in exposed locations. On the coldest night of January, exterior temperature at the canyon dropped to -22 degrees. Thomas built an evening fire in addition to his morning fire, burning perhaps 20 pounds of wood total for the day. The cabin maintained 60 degrees through the night. He slept comfortably under 2 blankets, never waking to tend the fire. That same night, Jakob Müller burned 45 pounds of wood and still watched his cabin temperature drop to 43 degrees by dawn. His children woke, crying from the cold. Anna was exhausted from nighttime fire tending. Jakob stood shivering in his own home and realized something fundamental had to change. Jakob Müller's firewood supply ran critically low in late January 1879. He had started winter with what he considered adequate reserves, 8 cords stacked against his cabin's north wall. By month's end, less than half a cord remained. At current consumption rates, he would run out completely within 10 days. The mathematics were brutal and simple. His family needed 40 to 50 pounds of wood daily to maintain barely livable interior temperatures. Cutting and hauling that quantity in extreme cold was nearly impossible. Jakob spent entire days in the forest, working until exhaustion, and still fell behind the consumption rate. Anna was approaching her breaking point as well. She had not slept more than 3 consecutive hours in weeks. The nighttime fire-tending routine destroyed any possibility of rest. She would fall asleep exhausted, wake 2 or 3 hours later to a cooling cabin, stumble to the fireplace in darkness, add wood, stoke the flames, wait until temperature rose slightly, then return to bed. 2 hours later, the cycle repeated. Their children suffered quietly. The 2 older boys, ages 8 and 10, tried to help by gathering kindling and splitting smaller pieces. But they were too young for serious woodcutting. Their daughter, age 6, had developed a persistent cough that worried Anna. The cold cabin was making the child sick. On January 28th, Jakob made a decision. He would swallow his pride and ask Thomas Brennan for help, not for firewood, though he needed that desperately. He needed to understand how Thomas's cabin worked, how one man stayed comfortable while entire families froze, despite burning 3 times the wood. The climb to Boulder Canyon, in deep snow and sub-zero cold, was dangerous. Jakob left before dawn, telling Anna he would return by nightfall. The 3-mile journey took 4 hours of exhausting effort. He broke trail through drifts, climbed icy sections using hands and feet, and arrived at the canyon alcove near midday, breathing hard and soaked with frozen sweat. Thomas's cabin showed no smoke. Jakob's first thought was that Thomas had frozen, that the canyon hermit had finally succumbed to his foolish experiment. But when he knocked, Thomas opened the door wearing only a wool shirt. The interior was warm, no fire burned in the pit. Jakob stood in the doorway, confused and exhausted. He asked how the cabin was warm without fire. Thomas explained he had built a fire that morning which burned for 3 hours and died 6 hours ago. The stone walls were still releasing stored heat. Jakob entered and touched the back wall. It radiated warmth like a stove. He sat on the bed and felt tears forming. His family was freezing in a cabin with a fire burning continuously. Thomas stayed comfortable with a fire that had been cold for half a day. The contrast was devastating and illuminating. Thomas offered coffee and food. Jakob accepted both. They sat in the warm cabin while Jakob explained his situation. He was out of wood, out of options, and out of pride. He needed Thomas to teach him how to survive this winter and the winters beyond. Thomas accompanied Jakob back to the valley that afternoon. They discussed thermal mass principles during the long descent through snow. Jakob listened with the intensity of a man learning information his family's survival depended upon. Thomas explained heat capacity, thermal bridging, and passive solar gain using simple terms and practical examples. They arrived at Jakob's cabin near dusk. Anna met them at the door, her exhaustion evident in her posture and expression. The interior was cold, despite a fire burning weakly in the fireplace. The children were bundled in every piece of clothing they owned. Thomas felt the temperature difference immediately. He examined the cabin's construction while Jakob added wood to the struggling fire. The structure was typical frontier building. 4 log walls with corner notching, mud chinking that had dried and cracked, a bark roof covered with sod, 1 small window, and a dirt floor. The cabin was losing heat faster than the fire could generate it. Thomas touched the log walls. They were cold, acting as thermal conduits, pulling warmth from the interior and transferring it to the frozen exterior. The chinking gaps allowed air infiltration. The roof leaked heat upward. Every surface was working against the occupants. He explained to Jakob that the cabin's fundamental design prevented heat retention. Improving it would require major reconstruction that could not happen in current conditions. But Thomas could offer immediate help. He invited Jakob's family to stay at the canyon cabin until the brutal cold passed. Anna protested weakly. They could not impose on Thomas. They had their own home. But Thomas was firm. His cabin had space and warmth to spare. He would not watch neighbors freeze when he had the means to help. They gathered essential supplies and made the journey to the canyon that evening. The children were frightened by the dark, narrow trail and steep climbs, but Anna and Jakob kept them moving. They arrived at the alcove after nightfall, guided by Thomas's lantern. Thomas built a fire, his first evening fire in weeks. The cabin warmed quickly. The children stopped shivering and began exploring the strange dwelling with its stone walls and cave-like qualities. Anna sat near the fire and cried quietly from relief and exhaustion. That night, 7 people slept in a cabin designed for 1. But everyone slept warm. The stone walls radiated heat through the darkness. Thomas lay awake monitoring the fire until it died to coals, then watched the temperature remain stable as the thermal mass did its work. At midnight, he heard Anna rise and approach the fireplace. She stood there for a moment, confused, touching the cold ashes. She whispered to Jakob that the fire was out. Jakob whispered back that he knew. They waited for the cold to come, but it did not. The cabin stayed warm. Anna returned to the children and slept through until dawn for the first time in 2 months. Morning arrived with exterior temperature at -18 degrees Fahrenheit. Inside the canyon cabin, Thomas's thermometer registered 61 degrees. The fire had been completely cold for 11 hours. Jakob woke and immediately checked the temperature himself, certain Thomas's thermometer was faulty. It was not. Thomas built a morning fire, while Anna prepared breakfast using the supplies they had brought. The children stayed in bed under blankets, warm and rested for the first time in weeks. The cabin felt like a miracle to the Mueller family, a space that defied their understanding of how winter and shelter worked. After breakfast, Thomas took Jakob outside to demonstrate the temperature difference directly. They stood in the bitter cold while Thomas explained his thermometer readings. Exterior, -18 degrees. Interior, 61 degrees. The difference was 59 degrees with no active fire. Jakob asked how this was possible. Thomas led him back inside and began a detailed explanation. He pointed to the stone walls, explaining they contained thousands of tons of granite. When the fire burned, heat energy transferred into the stone. The stone absorbed that energy and held it, releasing it slowly over many hours. He walked Jakob through the mathematics. A pound of granite heated 10 degrees stored approximately 200 units of heat energy. The walls surrounding them represented roughly 30,000 pounds of stone. Even heating that mass just 20 degrees meant storing millions of units of energy that would radiate back over the following 12 to 15 hours. Jakob struggled with the numbers but understood the principle. The stone was a battery for heat. Thomas's small fires charged the battery. The battery powered the cabin's warmth through cold nights. A conventional cabin had no battery, just walls that leaked heat as fast as fire produced it. Thomas showed Jakob his journal with months of temperature data. The pattern was undeniable and consistent. Single daily fires maintaining comfortable temperatures through extreme cold. Wood consumption 1/3 to 1/4 of conventional cabins. The scientific evidence supported what Jakob had experienced firsthand. Anna joined them and asked the question both she and Jakob were thinking. Could they build something like this? Could a family use these principles to survive Montana winters without the exhaustion and danger they had experienced? Thomas said yes, with caveats. The canyon location was unique and not replicable, but the principles could be adapted. Building against a cliff face, partially underground, or using stone interior walls could all provide thermal mass benefits. It required different thinking and more complex construction, but it was achievable. Jakob wanted to start immediately. Thomas counseled patience. They needed to survive the current winter first. Spring would be time for planning and building. For now, the Mueller family should stay in the canyon cabin as long as the brutal cold continued. The brutal winter finally broke in early March 1879. Temperatures moderated into the 20s and 30s. The Mueller family returned to their valley cabin with gratitude and a determination to build something better before the next winter arrived. Jakob had filled a notebook with sketches and notes during his weeks in Thomas's canyon cabin. Word of what had happened spread through the Boulder Creek settlement rapidly. The story transformed from mockery to curiosity. The cave hermit's folly had kept 5 people warm through the worst winter in living memory while burning a fraction of the firewood that conventional cabins consumed. Settlers began asking questions. In April, 3 families approached Thomas separately, asking for advice on thermal mass construction. Thomas shared his knowledge freely. He explained the principles, showed his journal data, and helped each family identify suitable building locations. Not everyone had access to canyon alcoves, but creative solutions emerged. The Henderson family found a south-facing cliff with a large overhang 2 miles from the settlement. The site was similar to Thomas's location, though less enclosed. They began construction in May, building a cabin that backed against the cliff and used the rock face as one wall. Thomas consulted on the design, helping them maximize thermal contact with the stone. The Carlson family chose a different approach. They identified a slight hillside depression and decided to build partially underground. They excavated 3 feet down into the slope, creating an earth-sheltered cabin with only the front wall and roof above grade. The surrounding earth would provide thermal mass similar to Thomas's stone walls, though less efficient. Jakob Müller designed the most ambitious adaptation. He found a location where large granite boulders had tumbled together, creating spaces between them. He planned to build his cabin within and around these boulders, incorporating them as interior thermal mass. The boulders would be inside the cabin, absorbing heat from the fire and radiating it back. Construction proceeded through the summer. Thomas visited each site regularly, offering advice on thermal bridging, insulation priorities, and ventilation. The builders made mistakes and adjustments, learning as they worked. By September, all 3 families had completed their new cabins. The Henderson cabin performed remarkably well, nearly matching Thomas's efficiency due to the extensive cliff contact. The Carlson earth-sheltered cabin worked adequately, but suffered from moisture issues they would need to address. Jakob's boulder cabin proved most innovative, with the massive stones inside the living space creating spectacular heat retention. Winter 1879-80 tested the new designs. All 3 families reported dramatic improvements over their previous cabins. Firewood consumption dropped by half to 2/3. Interior temperatures stayed stable. Nighttime fire tending became unnecessary. The thermal mass principle had proven adaptable to various implementations. Other settlers watched and learned. Over the next 3 years, a dozen more families built variations on thermal mass cabins. The techniques spread beyond Boulder Creek to other Montana settlements. Mining camps in rocky terrain adopted similar approaches. The knowledge Thomas had developed alone in his canyon was becoming common frontier wisdom. Thomas Brennan lived in his canyon cabin for 16 years. He continued trapping through the 1880s as fur markets declined and eventually disappeared. He supplemented income with occasional carpentry work, helping neighbors build and improve their thermal mass cabins. He never married, never sought recognition, and rarely traveled beyond the Boulder Creek area. In 1894, at age 59, Thomas died quietly in his cabin from pneumonia. Jakob Müller found him 3 days later when Thomas failed to appear for a scheduled visit. He was buried in the small Boulder Creek Cemetery with a simple marker that listed only his name and dates. The canyon cabin stood empty for several years. Occasionally, trappers or travelers used it as shelter, always remarking on its unusual warmth and construction. The stone walls continued their thermal work whether occupied or not, absorbing sun and releasing stored heat in eternal cycle. In 1903, a young mining engineer named David Chen surveyed the Boulder Creek drainage for copper deposits. He discovered the canyon cabin and spent a week sheltering there during late autumn cold. Chen was educated in thermodynamics and immediately recognized the sophistication of Thomas's design. He documented the cabin in his survey notes, calling it an exemplary application of thermal mass principles to frontier architecture. By the 1920s, most of the original thermal mass cabins had been abandoned as families moved to towns or left Montana entirely. But several structures remained occupied, passed to new owners who appreciated their superior performance. The Henderson Cliff Cabin housed 3 generations of the same family through 1960. Modern historians discovered Thomas's story in the late 1960s. A graduate student researching frontier architecture found David Chen's survey notes in university archives. The notes led to the canyon site where substantial portions of Thomas's cabin remained standing after 70 years of abandonment. Archaeological investigation documented the structure thoroughly. Researchers marveled at the thermal mass integration, the minimal but effective roof, the strategic window placement. They calculated that Thomas's design was approximately 60% more thermally efficient than conventional frontier cabins, a revolutionary improvement achieved with no technology unavailable in the 1870s. The story of Thomas Brennan illustrates essential truths about frontier innovation. Solutions emerged from desperate need rather than academic study. A widower watching his family freeze created heating technology that university-trained engineers would not formalize for decades. Knowledge spread through demonstration and practical benefit, not formal publication. Thomas's legacy persists in unexpected ways. Modern passive solar design and earth-sheltered architecture employ principles Thomas discovered through observation and experimentation. The idea that thermal mass can provide heating without fuel consumption is now fundamental to sustainable building, taught in engineering schools worldwide. The canyon cabin itself remains partially intact, protected now as a historical site. Visitors can still see the stone walls, touch the rock that held heat for Thomas Brennan on frozen nights in 1878. The stone remembers nothing, but it continues the work Thomas designed it for, warming slightly in sun, cooling slowly in shade, demonstrating that the earth itself can be humanity's furnace if we build with intelligence rather than habit.